Welcome. Bienvenidas a todas. I am Catherine Tracy Good, Tracy to my friends and colleagues, the director of the Tools for Researchers program at the Americas Research Network, or ARENET, and I'm so happy that you've been able to join us today for this presentation. We are thrilled to have Allyson Poska present as part of our series of Zoom talks called Researching the Americas on her project, They Called Me the Antichrist, the earliest opposition to smallpox vaccination in the Spanish Empire. Poska was a National Endowment of the Humanities, NEH, and Council of America's Overseas Research Centers, CAORC, Senior Research Fellow with ARENET in 2018. Please note that the NEH-CAORC Senior Research Fellowship is administered by CAORC and funded by the NEH under the fellowship programs at independent research institutions. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this event do not necessarily represent those of the NEH. Now, just a few words on logistics. After the interview, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. To participate in the Q&A, please send a message via the chat function at the bottom of the screen with your question. We will put you in the virtual queue, and when it is your turn, we will unmute you individually so you can ask your question directly. Also, please be advised that this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to ARENET's various platforms. We will contact you via the email address that you registered with to sign a release form if you participate in the Q&A after the presentation. Now, let me introduce you to Allyson Poska. She is Professor of History at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and the author of 4 books: Gendered Crossings, Women and Migration in the Spanish Empire, which was the winner of the 2017 Best Book Prize from the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women; Women and Authority in Early Modern Spain, The Peasants of Galicia, that won the 2006 Roland H. Bainton Prize for the Best Book in Early Modern History or Theology; Women and Gender in the Western Past and Regulating the People, The Catholic Reformation in 17th Century Spain. She also co-edited the Ashgate Research Companion to Women and Gender in Early Modern Europe and Early Modern Women, an Interdisciplinary Journal. Her work has been funded from grants, has been funded by grants from the NEH, CAORC, the American Council of Learned Societies, the John Carter Brown Library, the American Philosophical Society, and she recently received a rapid response grant on COVID-19 and the social sciences from the Social Sciences Research Council to continue work on the project she is presenting on today. She has served as a member of the Executive Council of the 16th Century Society, on the Executive Board of the Society for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Societies, and as president of the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women. And now I'm going to pass along the word to Dr. Poska.
Thank you so much. Let me get my screen up. I'm so glad to be here. I'm so excited to be able to present my new research to everybody. I want to thank Greta de Leon and Tracy Good for putting this together. Certainly sitting at home, it's great to be able to have some contact with people outside of my house. I spent 2018, 2019 conducting research in Spain and Mexico. I had certainly planned to be in Peru this past summer, but of course, because of COVID, I can't. But I do hope to get to Peru at some point to finish this work, and maybe even Manila. This is what I'm going to talk about today as part of a larger book project on race and gender and smallpox vaccination in the Spanish Empire. So first, to kind of set a little bit of the context. In the pre-modern world, smallpox took an absolutely devastating toll. Mortality rates ranged from lows of about 10% to 50% or even higher among previously unaffected communities. And those who'd survived, and there were plenty of people who survived, were often blinded or seriously disfigured. These outbreaks happened about once every 20 years at least, sometimes more often. until inoculation was introduced from the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 18th century. So with inoculation, placing the live smallpox virus into incision, you make a little incision in the arm and you put it into the person's arm, it usually produced a less severe infection followed by immunity, except for sometimes it led to full-blown cases of smallpox and even death. For reasons that are not entirely clear, inoculation found very few proponents in the Spanish Empire or until the 1770s. In fact, it was only after King Charles IV's brother, sister-in-law, and daughter all died of the disease that the distraught king first ordered the inoculation of the royal household, and that wasn't until 1798. He then made inoculation more widely available to his subjects. Soon after, King Charles received a copy of Edward Jenner's treatise on the use of cowpox as a smallpox vaccine. Although the mechanism of transmission is the same, which is this arm-to-arm transmission of infected fluid into a skin lesion, the use of cowpox rather than smallpox provided the desired immunity without any of the ill effects or potential mortality. King Charles is absolutely and immediately convinced, and he accepts a proposal from Francisco Xavier Balmis, a physician with experience in Cuba and Mexico, who had just translated an important French text on vaccination, to head what would become the first global public health initiative, the Royal Philanthropic Expedition to bring smallpox vaccination to the Spanish Empire. A year or so later, King Charles also ordered the opening of vaccination rooms across Spain. As a result, the vaccine would be administered for free to anyone who wanted it anywhere in the Spanish Empire. So a little bit about the Royal Philanthropic Expedition. The expedition consisted of Balmis, another physician, Jose Salvani, and a dozen or so medical assistants, nurses, and servants, as well as 22 boys between the ages of 3 and 9 years old. Conscripted from the charity hospital and orphanage in La Coruña in northwestern Spain, the boys had not yet been infected with the disease, and Balmis used them to keep the cowpox virus alive during the Atlantic crossing by vaccinating them sequentially. So here I have for you the map of the expedition. The expedition leaves La Coruña on the 30th of November of 1803. It goes first to the Canary Islands. They then make the Atlantic crossing to Puerto Rico. Balmis and Salvani then move the expedition to the Venezuelan coast, to Caracas, excuse me, and where Balmis and Salvani decide to split up. Balmis takes the vaccine next to Cuba and then to Mexico. 6 months later, he sails from Mexico City to Manila, to the Philippines, using 26 Mexican boys to transport the vaccine across the Pacific, where he and other physicians vaccinated thousands of Filipinos. In 1805, Balmis then moves the expedition to Macau, Canton, and then the island of St. Helena, Santa Elena, in the South Atlantic, where he actually vaccinates English troops. While Balmis is circumnavigating the globe, Salvani and his crew carry the vaccine through South America. After Caracas, they go Quito, they go Cartagena, Bogota, Quito, and down to Peru, where he vaccinates people until his death in the Andes in 1810. In barely 7 years, the Royal Philanthropic Expedition saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of Spanish subjects. However, the vaccination campaign was not always met with enthusiasm. You got to think about it. These are the earliest people who ever had to decide whether to submit to vaccination. Convincing the incredibly diverse populations of the Spanish Empire to vaccinate, and remember, this is going to include elite and non-elite whites of all classes, free and enslaved people of African descent, members of thousands of different indigenous groups whose acculturation to Spanish ways was still very considerably at the beginning of the 19th century, as well as mixed race people of all racial and cultural combinations. This would be an incredible challenge. And in fact, what ends up happening is these early attempts to vaccinate expose what are really and truly the first anti-vaxxers. In fact, the documents that I'll be talking about today, in the documents, the authorities actually use the Spanish version of the word. They say anti-vacinistas to describe the wide array of people who rejected vaccination. So typically, when people have talked about smallpox vaccination, both in the past and today, they have attributed resistance to things like undefined superstition and popular errors and a fear of new ideas. However, thus far, my research indicates 4 very specific strands of opposition to smallpox vaccination. The first, the vaccine was based on an idea of interchangeability of bodies that bothered people. The second, the fear of false and deadly vaccine. The third, fear of government intervention in the health of their children. And the fourth, an idea that mothers actually knew better how to weather the disease than medical authorities. And what I want to do today is take you through these 4 strands of opposition and the Crown's responses to them. So first, the problem of the interchangeable bodies. So smallpox vaccination is about a lot more than just the extension of a new medical technology. Because the vaccine was meant for everyone, regardless of race or gender, class or status, the vaccination campaign presents this notion of the interchangeability of bodies, that the same vaccine would be equally effective for all people. In their reports back to Madrid, Balmis and other vaccinators actually extolled the fact that they had been vaccinating people of all races, all classes, all ages, all sexes. And in fact, it's really interesting that although the regulations promulgated by Balmis required that vaccinators keep lists of the vaccinated, including their ages, their addresses, and their parents' names, he never once mentions keeping records of racial designations. And very few of the lists that I have been able to find even included that information. Now, this idea of the interchangeability of bodies stood in direct conflict with imperial race and gender hierarchies. Early modern societies were absolutely predicated on difference. In Europe, people distinguished themselves by class and gender. Nobles had different privileges, wore different clothing, and were often described as being of different blood than non-nobles. Women were different than men. From a Galenic perspective, in fundamental ways beyond lactation and menstruation, their bodies were believed to react differently to both diseases and to cures. In colonial settings like the Americas, racial distinctions were generally the first kind of indicator of a person's place in society. The whiter you were, regardless of your actual racial background, the higher up in the social strata you probably were. In fact, colonial Latin America was rife with restrictions based on race, not all of which were equally enforced, but all of which gave people a sense of understanding where they fit and where other people fit into society. Now, of course, gender and class and free and unfree status further complicate this social hierarchy, but the bottom line is early modern society was predicated on the notion that people, and thus their bodies, were not the same on any physical level. And that emphasis on difference is clear from a bunch of stuff that comes up in the documentation about vaccination. So to give you just a couple of examples, according to an official report, in the city of Corora in Venezuela, which by the way is, even at the time was way in the outback of Venezuela, the commandant reported The ladies of the city were disgusted and absolutely refused to go to the house of the vaccinator, as they believe it degrades the high privileges of their nobility, unquote. So here you've got, right from the outset, class-based opposition to vaccination. I don't want me and my kids associating with them and their kids. In Cuba, Dr. Tomás Romay, the primary proponent of vaccination on the island, reported in October of 1804 that he had vaccinated 14 whites and 248 people of color, but complained that, in his words, "It is indisputable that in the space of 1 month, many more than 14 white babies were born in this city and its suburbs," unquote. Clearly, white Cubans were not presenting their children for vaccination, and Romay chastised them for valuing the lives of their enslaved Africans more than the lives of their own children. But this is probably not how those Cuban mothers and fathers understood their decision not to vaccinate. The idea that you could take cowpox lymph from the arm of a person of African descent and put it into the arm of a white person seemed to many at least unseemly and definitely socially problematic. Because the disease seemed to strike enslaved Africans and adults and poor indigenous adults and children much more intensely, probably because they've not been as exposed in earlier epidemics, many whites clearly just did not think the vaccine was meant for their children. You know, this is for somebody else's kids. Number 2. False and deadly vaccines. No doubt because of the, no doubt as a result of the unpredictability of inoculation, many mothers were easily influenced by rumors about the ineffectiveness of what came to be called false vaccine, as well as rumors of deaths from vaccination. In terms of false vaccines, the problem generally arose from efforts to transport the desiccated lymph between either plates of glass or attached to thread and then rehydrate it. However, the vaccinator could not know whether or not the lymph was live until nearly a week after he had implanted it, often in dozens or even hundreds of people. And that's actually what this image I have for you. This is in the text by Balmis. This shows the other vaccinators what it's supposed to look like every day for 2 weeks after day 4, with the pus put in the lesion. As a result, because they couldn't tell for the first few days, although some children underwent the procedure, they were not in fact vaccinated, and they could and did fall victim to the disease. Moreover, as medical practitioners competed to be the first to get the lymph, they often made unsubstantiated allegations about the false vaccines of other doctors. Balmis in particular regularly accused his rivals of promoting false vaccines in order to highlight his own role in expanding access. For instance, when he got to Puerto Rico, he accused Dr. Francisco Oyer, who was the main advocate of vaccination on the island, of vaccinating with false lymph that Oyer had acquired from a physician friend on the Danish island of St. Thomas prior to Balmis's arrival, even though Oyer had produced clear evidence of the lymph's vitality. Similarly, in Veracruz, Mexico, Carlos Escoffier was accused of spreading the rumor that the lymph being used by a Dr. Monzon, who was the surgeon commissioned by the city council to vaccinate, that his lymph was false, a rumor that gets amplified by Balmis and led to Monzon asking that Escoffier be criminally charged for what he called his seductive anti-vaccination conversations. I love that phrase. Monzon actually ends up decrying the powerful obstacles of the anti-vaxinistas. Now, doctors are not alone in talking about the fear of false vaccines. In northern Peru, Salvini reported that when the native people saw how simple the procedure was, and I quote, "They began to doubt it, and there were even some who said it was false. And when I promised it would protect them from smallpox, they did not believe me, and they called me the Antichrist," which is great. And that's, of course, where I get the title of the talk. Across the empire, rumors swirled that the vaccine could cause death. From Pamplona, a physician, Vicente Martinez, wrote to Ignacio Muria, Ruiz de la Suriaga, who was one of the earliest vaccinators in Spain, that the news that the only child of a noble family had died after being vaccinated had started to, in his words, delay somewhat several individuals who wanted to, or who earlier wanted to vaccinate their children. Other people also seemed fearful that it could cause death. Even in Mexico, according to Balmis, even after they accosted 20 women, and they accost these women and grab them and pull them in to vaccinate them and their children. After they vaccinate the children, every single one of the women goes to the apothecaries and asks for the poison to be removed from their children's arms. In a way that I think is probably really familiar to us, even in the 21st century, once mothers heard rumors about false vaccines and or a child, any child, anywhere, dying, they were unlikely to vaccinate their own children. Number 3, fear of government intervention. It seems clear that indigenous mothers in Mexico were particularly fearful of vaccination because of their negative experiences with government authorities in previous epidemics. During the 1796-97 smallpox epidemic, municipal authorities had gone door to door looking for children who might be infected with the intention of removing them from their homes to quarantine huts outside of town. According to the authorities, parents reacted by hiding their children in holes in the backyard and by wrapping them in carpets and putting them up in the rafters of their houses in order to keep the authorities from taking their kids away. In the indigenous village of Teotitlan de Valle, despairing mothers stormed the quarantine building, attacking the soldiers on guard to do what they called extract their children from the quarantine hut. Some arrests, interestingly enough, mostly of the men, and an extended investigation resulted. And not surprisingly, a decade later, once vaccination is introduced, the local administrator noted that little progress had been made in terms of vaccination in the area. I mean, these mothers are still mad from a decade earlier. Even when authorities convinced parents to allow their children to undergo the procedure, parents rarely complied with the requirement that they return for a follow-up visit around day 9 or 10. So if you look again at this image, this is the point at which they say that in their words, the lymph had ripened and they could tell that it was actually working. Parents never came back, and the doctors also needed these return visits to maintain enough live virus to continue vaccinating. It is absolutely clear to me that when it came to the health of their children, even people who agreed to vaccination were distrustful and wanted to minimize their dealings with medical professionals and government officials as much as possible. And fourth, mothers know best. Across races, mothers' emphatic rejection of vaccination was rooted in beliefs about maternal authority over their children's bodies, which was key to women's identities in lots of indigenous cultures, and also promoted by Enlightenment thinkers in Europe who placed this new emphasis on mothers and promoted ideas about the nature of women that was focused on their roles as caring and attentive mothers. Mothers by nature were supposed to be the primary providers of medical care to their children. However, at the exact same time that talk is happening, women who provided medical care, including both mothers and midwives, but also wet nurses, were increasingly under attack by male practitioners and royal authorities. And Enlightenment culture paradoxically argued that the best mothers were expected to comply with the advice and submit to the authority of male doctors. So what we have is all kinds of authorities hurling insults at parents who refuse to vaccinate. In Cuba, doctors called them negligent, idiotic, and insensitive. In northwestern Spain, the Capitan General bemoaned the fact that, and I quote, "a small portion of the miserable masses sacrifices their innocent children to the most delinquent indolence and guilty obstinance," unquote. Now, although these demeaning comments were not usually aimed specifically at mothers, they're generally aimed at parents, these critiques clearly had negative implications. In a culture in which mothers were expected to be naturally able to provide the best care for their children, these criticisms really strike at the core of women's being and no doubt made them even less likely to vaccinate. In addition, many indigenous women refused to submit their children for vaccination, believing that they could take care of it better with native remedies and maternal care. For instance, during the 1790-91 smallpox outbreak in Chile, a captain sent to try and convince the indigenous Mapuche peoples to quarantine wrote back that to his commandant that the Mapuche had absolutely rejected and all of his efforts in favor of their own remedies, which included bathing and drinking fresh and cold drinks. Not surprisingly, in 1807, when a member of the Balmis expedition arrived in Chile, he found that the procedure met with some serious resistance outside of the major cities. But this really shouldn't surprise us. I mean, the Mapuche had dealt with smallpox for nearly 3 centuries at that point, and clearly they believed that they had treatment well under control. Similarly, in Mexico during the 1796-97 epidemic, parents preferred sweat baths, which in Spanish are temazcales, which according to the authorities, the Indians used for all illnesses. Mexican authorities also said that mothers were giving their children lime juice to drink and bathe in to cure the disease. In the ensuing decade, their confidence in their own remedies remained quite strong. When Balmis arrives to Mexico in 1804, he was always complaining that so few people were submitting to vaccination that they would lose the live lymph. Now, in general, in populated areas, by the late 18th, early 19th century, the mortality rates are only about 10%. So it seemed to these mothers that in most cases, with traditional medicines and proper care, their children would survive, and they could see very little benefit in submitting their otherwise healthy children to vaccination. So how do Spanish authorities respond to the anti-vaxinistas? They do so in a variety of interesting ways. So first, in terms of this problem of the interchangeability of bodies. The authorities declare that the vaccine was a sign of monarchical benevolence and an indication of the desired reciprocity between the king and his subjects. Free to everyone as a sign of the great generosity of the monarch, to everyone without regard to race, gender, class, or status. Submitting to the procedure was going to be an indication of one's love for the king and one's patriotism. In fact, the sermons and speeches and decrees about vaccination nearly all invoke patriotism and love for the king, which are the obligations of all Spanish subjects. If loyalty to the king was not enough, they also regularly used language about the benefits to all humanity to try and convince mothers to submit their children for vaccination. At least in this moment, the bodily differences that really marked the different inhabitants of the Spanish Empire and hindered acceptance of the vaccine were minimized as authorities presented the diverse populations of the Spanish Empire as really undifferentiated subjects of the king and more broadly members of the human race. So they kind of slide all those differences under the rug. Second, in terms of false and deadly vaccines, doctors, governments, officials, and clergy all promoted the idea that the procedure had no side effects. They told mothers over and over again that the procedure required no hospitalization, that the incision caused little pain, and this is always my favorite, that their children could play as usual immediately afterwards. Clearly, the ability for your kids to play was very important. They also spent a remarkable amount of time and energy making the vaccination rooms comfortable for women and children. And they put on these kind of elaborate displays of the safety of the vaccine by having medical practitioners vaccinate either their own children or the children of important people in town in public, so everybody could see that it was safe. They also used bands and orchestras and fireworks to turn vaccinations into big spectacles and try and alleviate the anxiety that way. However, for the most part, these efforts seem to have met with the same indifference as the appeals to all humanity. In response to concerns about government intervention, and I think this is fascinating, they absolutely refused to make vaccination compulsory. In fact, except for a brief period in Cuba just after 1808, there is absolutely no support for compulsory vaccination. In fact, at one point, the Captain General of Extremadura in Spain suggested that once a month, parish priests submit a list of the recently baptized children so that, and I quote, the justices might look for them and make them vaccinate. So he sends this suggestion to Madrid, and although the royal authorities really liked the idea of the priests submitting the lists of the babies, they did not approve of the justices tracking down parents and forcing them to vaccinate. Rather, they write back to the Capitan and they encourage him to persuade the priests to convince the parents to partake of the vaccine and to never use coercion. In fact, nearly all the documentation talks about persuasion and the use of kind words to convince parents to bring their children to be vaccinated. This time around, and you really see this in contrast to earlier epidemics, the government was not going to force anybody to do anything they didn't want to do. And finally, in terms of dealing with this confusing ideas of maternal expectations, some authorities actually advocated for teaching women to vaccinate their own children. And this is a terrific image from Pedro Hernandez's Spanish translation, again, of a French text. In this text, Hernandez takes a very egalitarian stance, noting fathers, mothers, and wet nurses can perform vaccination equally with the same utility and good success. The Bishop of Oaxaca goes even farther, saying, not only can fathers, mothers, and wet nurses do it to good effect, but, and I quote, it is really an operation more appropriate for women because of the greater softness of their hands, unquote. Romay in Cuba actually creates a little pamphlet to teach mothers to vaccinate their children. However, these attempts also seem to have had little effect and were quickly rejected by most medical practitioners who quickly transform the procedure into an operation, and they start to use that word that requires professional expertise. So looking kind of across the Spanish Empire, at least in the first round of vaccinations, in some places these attempts are more effective than others. In Guadalajara, Mexico, in Alicante, Spain, thousands of people are vaccinated. While in Madrid, authorities are unable to convince more than 1 or 2 people a day to bring their children to the main hospital. And the implications of this are really serious because unless they keep vaccinating people, they can't keep the lymph alive, so they can't keep vaccinating people. Moreover, after a few years, enough children had been born to lay the foundation for a new epidemic. So although Romay and his colleagues had been vaccinated thousands of people in Cuba in 1804, in 1808, when a slave ship from Charleston again brings smallpox to the island, enough of the population was epidemiologically vulnerable to create a serious epidemic. And the island faced additional epidemics in 1812 and again in 1815. The same thing happens in Puerto Rico. They have a serious epidemic about once every 20 years. On the Iberian Peninsula, the Napoleonic War interrupts the vaccination campaign, although Napoleon has all of his troops vaccinated. And as a result, the epidemics occur pretty regularly over the course of the 19th century. Even when the authorities could convince people to vaccinate in the initial moments of a vaccination campaign or an epidemic, they just could not sustain their efforts or people's enthusiasm. So why? I think that this is a lot about mixed messages that get put forward during the vaccination campaign. If you think about it, on the one hand, they're asserting that all bodies are the same in a world where everybody's bodies are clearly different. Similarly, after promoting the safety and efficacy of inoculation for most of the 18th century, now authorities are saying inoculation may have been dangerous, but vaccination is absolutely safe. Less than a decade before, the government had been going and taking people's sick children out forcibly from their homes. Now, from the mother's perspective, they were trying to lure them to bring their otherwise healthy children in for a medical procedure of questionable efficacy. We should not be surprised that the mothers were suspicious of the government's motives. And finally, there is this whole problem of the mixed messages about women and healthcare for their children. Women were, on the one hand, by nature, the best providers and could be taught to vaccinate, except for now, when they're not supposed to, and they're supposed to submit to the authority of male doctors. I think that the parallels between these first round of anti-vaxxers and today's opponents of vaccination are pretty striking, and I think probably a lot of you have heard things that sound familiar. One day I came back to my apartment in Mexico City, having just read about the Mothers' Revolt in Teotitlán de Valle, to see the headlines in the New York Times that Orthodox Jewish mothers in Brooklyn and Rockland County were hiding their children from health officials during the measles epidemic. And we are starting to see, we have over the past few months seen the same thing happen with COVID. Then as now, many mothers were distrustful of government intervention and believed that they could provide the best healthcare for their children. Much like the chickenpox and measles parties that many anti-vax parents hold, these mothers seem to have been less anxious about the disease than about the dangers of the procedures and the intentions of government and medical authorities. For these first anti-vaxxers, the decision to vaccinate was not about science denial or even superstition, but I think it was about the assertion of maternal authority and a profound distrust of government and medical professionals. I think from their perspective, they knew that mothers knew best. Thanks. And now I'm glad to answer any questions.
All right, just a quick reminder, and I put this in the chat as well, that to ask a question, please send a message via the chat function. It's normally, you'll find it at the bottom of the screen. We will put you in a virtual queue, and when it's your turn, we'll unmute you individually so that you can ask your question directly. And our first question comes from Lauren Rainford. Let me find you. And okay, Lauren, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have a few questions, so I'll ask one, and if there's time, maybe the others can be asked at the end. But my first question is, what was the global reaction to this vaccination campaign? Did other empires enact the same response to the disease?
So not on this same level. Certainly, probably the best example is the French Empire also has the kind of what you might call like the health bureaucracy to undertake it, but they don't do it in this same really methodical way that the Spanish do it. And let me say, you know, it really is the Royal Philanthropic expedition that makes this a global campaign. Nobody else thinks of it as the same kind of imperial project as the Spanish do.
Our next question is from Anik Chartrand.
Hi there, thank you. I'm currently wearing a mask in a library, so I don't know if you can hear me properly or if it's being mumbled.
No, you're fine.
Okay, great. I'm wondering if this type of opposition continued for later vaccines, like in the 19th and all the way into the 20th century. And are these oppositions more like specifically for the Spanish Empire then throughout these years, or did this become more like a global response to vaccinations?
So this is part of what's been really interesting to me. And a little bit, this is the kind of the sad ending to this story, right? It takes more than 200 years to eradicate smallpox after the vaccine, right? Smallpox is not officially eradicated until 1980. And when I gave a version of this presentation to the CDC, to the immunization division of the CDC, they were like, well, what do you know, are we going to be able to get rid of COVID? And I'm like, I don't think so, right? Because actually these oppositions are really quite strong. And they're strong not only against smallpox vaccination, but against all other kinds of vaccines. And kind of across, it doesn't matter, you know, it is indigenous peoples, it's well-educated peoples, it is, everybody has on some level these same concerns. And the fact that there are, you know, for instance, problems with some of the first polio vaccines mean that polio still has not been eradicated because, again, this is world of false and deadly vaccines. So it's actually very much the same and seems to me, at least at this stage in my research, to be the same thing into the 19th and 20th centuries. And really, even today.
Our next question comes from Patricia.
Thank you very much. I mean, I just mentioned it's not a question, but it's a comment. I was just sort of reiterating my comment was that on your point that similar enterprises did not take place in other empires, I think it's exactly true. That's also my perception. And I studied the Portuguese Empire, and I was just saying that there were studies conducted with slaves in Angola, and enslaved bodies were requested to a sort of a testing hospital in Angola, but there was no campaign. There was nothing of that sort. And that what you mentioned about assertions of maternal authority and skepticism of the medical profession was still very, very salient in 19th and 20th century Brazil, especially with the emergence of the science of puericulture. So I didn't really have a question. I had a comment, but I thank you very much for this talk. It was really very interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think that is, I mean, I know that the British they do some vaccination, particularly of enslaved peoples in places like Jamaica. They are engaged. I mean, everybody's engaged with trying to, particularly interestingly enough, with enslaved people, to get them vaccinated, but it doesn't lead to bigger things. And it certainly, like I said, doesn't bring an end to smallpox.
Okay, we're going to return to Lauren, our first person with questions. She said she had a few others, if that's okay with you, Lauren.
That is fine with me. So based on the lecture we heard today, thank you again for presenting. It sounds like, you know, this was a global campaign. They pulled out all of the bells and whistles with fireworks and orchestras. And it sounds like it was a huge financial cost to the crown, especially with the vaccine being free. So I'm wondering what the ramifications of that was, you know, how in debt did the Crown go? And then especially trying to keep in mind, did that at all impact the decision to not hold another campaign when this new generation of individuals who were not immune to smallpox started to grow up as well?
So it's really interesting to see. So everywhere that Balmis goes, he's got a royal edict that says, don't worry, the Crown's going to pay for everything. All you've got to put him and all these other people and all these children up and feed them. And everybody's got to be for free. But don't worry, the Crown will pay for it. And in some places that I was able to read through, like the account books, that they would then send back and say, excuse us, you owe us, you know, tons of money. There is no evidence that anybody gets reimbursed for this. And a lot of, particularly bishops, kind of wealthier officials in a lot of these towns end up paying for a lot of this out of their own pocket. I did love seeing, I can't remember, I want to say that it was in Zacatecas, Mexico, you know, like the list of all the different kinds of fireworks they bought, like it was a super detailed accounting of what the Crown owed them. But I think that at the local level, this has a huge impact, right? Nobody, as long as they thought that the Crown was going to pay for it, it seemed like a worthy endeavor. Once they realized it was going to come out of their own pockets, and when I say them, I mean like bishops and city councilmen and people like that, they lost their enthusiasm, because these things are really quite costly. Even if actually the actual procedure, you know, putting this pus in children's arms doesn't cost much in and of itself.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, our next, sorry for the buzzing. Our next presenter is Gregory Hamovich, and I'm unmuting. There, Gregory, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask what, if you know something, or if you found some information about indigenous treatments of smallpox in that period. I mean, the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. I'm interested particularly in the Mexican region.
So like I said, so generally the authorities speak in very broad terms, but you know, this business of using limon, either drinking it or bathing in it, and using temazcales are the most common treatments. Other than that, what tends to show up in the documentation are kind of general, you know, medicines of women and household medicines and those kinds of terms. So it's hard to get a handle on really specific treatments, but they still tend to prefer, whatever it is they're doing, they prefer that to vaccination.
Yes, yes, I understand. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Up next is Patricia. Let me unmute again. Okay.
Hi. Yes, I was very interested in hearing about that bishops were sponsoring these campaigns, because in the late 18th century, in the Portuguese context, both colonial and in the metropole, the debates around vaccines were were opposing sort of physicians and ecclesiastics. So I thought that was very interesting fact that that you mentioned that bishops were sponsoring these campaigns. And the ecclesiastical argument against vaccines was that it hinged on the introduction of animal matter into one's body. And I was wondering if you found anything like that as well. Oh, and also just if there were manuals of physical education circulating, because this, again, for the Portuguese case, you see a lot of manuals in this moment emerging, and they're written by physicians, but they're intended for mothers to give the proper methods of how to raise a child.
Yeah, so to answer the second part first, yes, there are lots of these manuals, and I've been reading them for an article I'm writing right now, and none of them talk about either inoculation or vaccination, which is really interesting to me. They ignore that altogether. In terms of the bishops, you know, the deal in the Spanish Empire is really different because the crown controls appointments of bishops, both on the peninsula and in the Americas. And so all these guys, all these bishops are appointed by the crown. And so there's this really tight connection. And they are, in large part, they are doing what their boss tells them to do, because their boss is not the Pope, their boss is the King of Spain, you know? And so I think that's what makes it really different than the Portuguese case.
Thank you.
Oh, and about the thing about animal parts and bodies, I see that in the medical treatises, but I haven't seen anybody outside of medical practitioners express any concern about that. Almost all of these little pamphlets for mothers, that's one of the things that they address. But I haven't seen other signs that they are worried about the introduction of animal pus.
Thank you.
Okay, we now have a question from Francis Valencia Turco. Let me find you. And, okay, Francis?
Yes, hi.
The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. And I was struck, as probably we all were, with all of the parallels.
Francis, we can't hear you.
Going in and out.
But I can see that I can see your question in the chat. Why was there such resistance from the Crown and authorities to enforce or require smallpox vaccination? This is something really I'm thinking a lot about, but I do think it has something to do with the tremendous resistance towards government intervention in health that people had experienced in earlier epidemics. You know, Charles IV wants to be seen as this really benevolent monarch. He doesn't want to be seen as the king who made you do those things. And I think that this is about reconceptualizing it in a way that it's interesting to me. Like, nobody actually says we're not going to do compulsory vaccination because it is a foregone conclusion in all of the conversations and in all of the treatises that we would not, we being the authorities, we would never require people to be vaccinated. And I think that right now I'm thinking that's about the power of this message about monarchical authority and the relationship between a monarch and his subjects. Next.
Okay, our next question is from Anik. I'm going to unmute. Anik, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. I found it absolutely fascinating. And I'm wondering, because it took so long for the eradicating the vaccine, did it become compulsory at some point? Or was there a moment where everyone just decided, you know, we should take this vaccine? Or like, how did it kind of end in a sense?
I'm not sure I know all of the answer to that question. You know, in most kind of post-World War II democracies, what ends up happening is that in order to go to school, you have to be vaccinated. And so that's, you know, for all of us who are of a certain age, we were all vaccinated against smallpox in order to go to school. and I think that that is certainly in the West, that's kind of the primary mechanism for getting people vaccinated. If there's something else that goes on, I have to say I don't know that part of the story yet. Although you can look around and you can see that there is still there's still polio, there's still there's not smallpox, but there are a variety of other measles, the diseases that we have vaccinations for, and it's still so hard to get people to vaccinate. So, I mean, and even in the United States, where officially it is compulsory, it's not, because every state has different rules about the situation in which you can ask for an exception. And increasing numbers of people are asking for exceptions.
Okay, that was our last question. So first and foremost, I would like to thank Allyson Poska for such a fantastic presentation and such a timely presentation as we are thinking about vaccinations and how to proceed with vaccinations. I'd also like to thank, I'm going to screen share here just briefly. I'd also like to thank Greta de Leon, the Executive Director of ARENET, who is working the tech behind the scenes, Katie Jost from CAORC for all of her assistance, and to all of you for joining us today. We hope that you will join us again in 2 weeks for the next presentation in our Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace presentation. And please stay tuned for more from the Researching the Americas Zoom talks in the future. Have a fantastic Friday, and thank you again, Allyson.
Well, thank you everybody for showing up on a Friday. It was great fun.